Hello, Tim Wilmot here, and welcome to my watercolor demo. This time focusing on people in shadows. So you have a scene, a large dark area, maybe lots of shadows. You want to introduce some people into that scene because people introducing figures into a scene, it adds a bit more interest, it helps with the scale, it helps with composition. It brings so many things to a scene. And how can you have a street scene or a busy scene as we got here in Venice without people? So a large dark area, how do we cope with and introduce figures into the scene to make things look realistic, just to add a little bit more interest? So why would I choose this picture? So it is a scene in central Venice. We've got a number of different things helping with the composition. We've got a little bit of a perspective here with the lines of the canal here leading us down into the picture. Some perspective of the shops here facing onto the canal as well, leading us down. We've got the lovely bell tower in the distance there. A barge has pulled up here alongside the canal selling vegetables, fruit. So we've got these figures in nice silhouettes as well around the top of the barge there. Some shoppers as well, some walkers going up and down, some people coming towards us, some people going away from us. I think quite a nice element are these stairs here leading down. Again, just helping with the perspective, those lines leading us down into the picture. And these mooring posts as well, they add a little bit more of a dimension to the scene with the ropes around the top there, and this canopy covering the scene. Also good from a watercolor point of view in that we've got different values. So we've got the bright light behind, the sun is coming from the right hand side, hitting the buildings here on the left, so they're brightly lit, and then the darks of, well, the canopy, practically half of the picture nicely silhouetted, which works well, that darker value, the stronger value than the light behind it. So we'll see how we get on. Now the paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford. This is 300 grams in weight, 140 pounds. It's 15 inches by 11 inches and secured with some masking tape. I'm often asked if I pre-wet the paper or stretch it. So that's where you're soaking it and then taping it down, letting it dry, taping it down. No, I don't do that. The paper will buckle a little bit, but I don't mind too much. So with the outline sketch, our first stage, of course, getting in the main shapes of the composition, and I've started with the bell tower, which I've got to be pretty careful with. And I'm using an HB pencil here, and those three little archways need to be fairly equal in size. And of course I need to get the dimensions of the bell tower right as well. I can't make it look too narrow, too fat. So it's quite, I know it's in the background, but it needs to be quite accurate and faithful to the scene, being quite an iconic part of Venice. So just on the left hand side, some basic shapes of the opposite buildings. And then the steps on the bridge going over the canal, and one of those mooring posts. They're a bit like upturned fat blunt pencils, and then one the opposite way, left side, right side. Now the canopy of the barge, it's got a nice sort of gentle curve to it at the front and a nice dark triangular bit at the front, and then just this skyline, almost like a skyline of the top of the barge, different bits of produce sticking out, silhouetted against the light background. We've got a post here, a post or two. I'll just put in one at the bottom of the steps, and then a little bit of an exercise in perspective, getting these lines right up the left and the right hand side of the canal. A few shop blinds, again thinking about the tops of those blinds, getting them right with the perspective in the scene. Now on the right hand side we've got the right hand buildings. Got to make sure they're parallel to the bell tower, so visually just looking at that as I'm drawing these vertical lines. And also what can help me is as I'm drawing these vertical lines, trying to make them parallel, using as a reference point the masking tape on the left or the right, just to help me get those lines vertical. Now figures, this is what this video is all about, getting these figures, dealing with figures in the shadows. Well, first thing, having them silhouetted, as we're doing here with a couple of figures, having those people, those vendors on the barge, they're in deep contrast to the brightly lit background. So that's the first thing that will help us there. And then another figure here on the side. Now this person will be in the shadow, so we've got to think, of course they've got to be a different value to the shade, so they're either going to be darker or lighter, and maybe not all one color, maybe a darker jacket, lighter trousers, or vice versa. And then we've got a figure walking. I'll have this figure walking away from us with a little shopping trolley, of course, just to, I've got to have figures with shopping bags or shopping trolleys, because it is, although it's in Venice, it's still an area, I guess, where the locals are buying their produce. Have another figure connected to that middle person, so not having them all standing out on their own. I'm using a harder pencil than I normally would use here. Normally I would use a 2B or 3B pencil. So those three archways, they're not right. So I don't often use an eraser, rubber, but this time it was just bugging me, that, so I've got to get them a little bit better before putting paint to paper. That's a little bit better. And then a few more architectural details. There's yes, there's those three arches where the bells are, and then just below that there's two arches on the facade of the bell tower. Slight bit of shade on some areas of the buildings on the left that aren't catching the light. A few more lines just to help with the perspective, and when I add in the windows, I've got like a top and a bottom guideline to work with, which probably in most cases these guidelines won't show up too much in the finished painting. If they do, it doesn't really matter, because I'm painting in a loose style. I think it adds to a bit of the charm of a watercolor when you can see some of those pencil lines still showing in the finished painting. So that doesn't bother me too much. Now, again, a bit of an exercise in perspective, getting these steps right as we're coming down to the bottom, coming down into the middle, almost like a fan in a way. Going to be a shallower angle at the top and a deeper angle as we come down to the bottom. Another little tricky thing, getting in the step angles right here, the horizontals. Something like that, and then the bit in the angle, the back bit of that step there. As I say, it's got to be right. I could have got my eraser rubber out again and gone over that again, but just go over it again, slightly darker. So a bit more work on the barge. A few boxes of produce, wooden boxes, some slats, just adding in a few different shapes and lines. Then we've got the ropes on top of those mooring posts. Let's just cross-hatch that shopping trolley so I know what it's going to be. And then on these shops on the right hand side, just a few vertical lines. There's loads in the picture, there's loads in the photo. We'll not put them all in, otherwise it would be a bit too busy on the right hand side, which we don't want it to be. We don't want to put too much detail on the right hand side. Maybe get in another figure in the background there. That could be maybe a light figure compared to the background below the bell tower there. That would be quite dark, so that would be in another way like another silhouette. So that's the outline drawing done, and second stage is for me to lay down the first wash. Now my palette that I've got here is really my travel palette, so it's just got 3 colors in it. A blue called Cinereous Blue from Sennelier, a French paint. I've also got a bit of lavender in the top right there, just to make it a bit more opaque. Top left, the yellow is a lemon yellow, and then bottom left is a Windsor red, and then bottom right is it's actually black, an ivory black. So first of all, with the sky, and going in with this light blue color, going over the outlines I did of the buildings on the left, over the tower, because the tower is going to be darker. If you look at the photograph, it's darker in value, so it doesn't matter. So we've gone over that. We don't need to follow those lines or be too precise with that. And then that sky wasn't too wet, so I'm now going in with the base color, what will be the actual end colour of the buildings on the left hand side with this sort of lighter brown mix, making up my brown with a yellow and a red, maybe a touch of blue. But as I'm mixing it and getting different combinations, I'm getting different colours appearing, different shades of brown. Some a bit more in the top left corner, a bit more yellow, and keeping it fairly dry here. The brush I'm using is a mop brush, and it's a synthetic mop brush. This is from a Raphael, a French manufacturer. Now the steps, a bit darker. You can see in that bottom well, I'm making quite a nice brown colour there. So I will be going over some of this again, but this is just getting in the base colour just to cover the white paper, except any parts that are going to be the lightest part of the finished painting. So if it was some part of some figures, tops of their heads, their shoulders, or maybe the top of a car, or windows being reflected in the bright light, then I would try and leave those unpainted, leave the paper. So we're just going over the barge details. Now, beyond where this barge is and in front of the bell tower, there's a very large square. And because the light is coming from the right hand side, there's this sort of shard of light coming through the middle of the scene, which I'm trying to retain there. So I'm going to leave that, if I can, unpainted. So that's why I did that horizontal line across there, just to indicate where, beyond that, that's where that bright light is coming in. So down the right hand side, cover up everything. It could be any colour. Could have added in red here, make it warm, blue to make it cool. It is quite, the actual paving stones here are quite cool in colour. They're like very like a bluey grey in a way. So that's why I've added in that base colour of that blue there. So after the first wash, everything's got to dry 100%, and if the paper had buckled a little bit, it's going to flatten out as well. I have speeded up the drying process with a hairdryer, so we've fast forwarded to the third stage, which is to go in with the darks and the shadows. So now using a slightly smaller mop brush, but you need a brush with a good edge to it, a good point, because we're going to be doing a little bit more precise work here on the bell tower and getting the edges, getting a nice edge to it. So we need to make sure a brush gives us a good edge, and then with a mop brush, judging the right level of paint in the brush, not too much so that when you put the brush to paper it all suddenly explodes out over the painting, and not too little so that nothing happens when you start painting or you run out. So I'm mixing and mixing and mixing, just making sure we've got the right colour, and now holding the brush closer to the tip for a bit more control. Most of the time I would be holding the brush at the other end, so for me it just helps with more of a looser approach to things when I'm, well, first of all, I might be standing. If I wasn't doing a video, I would be standing and holding the brush at the opposite end to the hairs, so to speak. So it just makes it a bit looser. Now, do need to be a bit careful going around these archways, because we've got, of course, the sky. We can see through the top of the bell tower. We can see the sky beyond, and then those 3 bells inside. But this being in the distance, we don't want to put too much detail here. The focal point is down below, the street scene and these figures. So down, further down, you might be able to see that we're getting different shades of brown here as we're going further down the bell tower, so it's not all one value. Maybe a little bit darker towards the bottom. So I added in my ivory black. Which I think, if used in moderation, is alright. I'm sure a lot of people would frown on using black, or Payne's grey is another one that is a no-no with a lot of artists, or neutral tint I very often use. But this being my travel palette, I'm not at my main location, so I just had a bit of ivory black to spare. Just added a bit of this bluey mix into the bell tower, just to add a bit more interest to the brickwork. Don't want to overdo it too much. Now, painting around, need to be a bit careful painting around some of these figures, especially that one in the distance. So again, it's good to have a brush that's got a good point or edge to it for doing this more precise work. And continue on down to street level, or where this this shard of light is coming through the square. Somewhere about there. Now the opposite side of the canal, the sides of the buildings facing us, they're slightly in the shade, so getting these sort of almost triangular shapes of that side. Careful to paint around things I want to have a different value or be lighter, and then closer towards us. Another side or gap in the building. That gives a bit more, it hopefully instantly gives a bit more form to that left hand side. So I can add in a few little window details. Of those buildings on the left hand side. So after this, the next step's going to be to go in with darker colours still, these posts, and then working down those steps. So I'm just going to let things dry off just a little bit before going on to the next step. And I've just lifted out a little bit of the shadier part of that house, that building, with a bit of a paper towel there, just to just perhaps where the light was hitting it. I think it needed it not to be too dark. So back with a slightly bigger mop brush here, and with these mooring posts, really dark, almost one of the darkest parts of the painting. They're in the shade. Behind them is this brightly lit building. A big difference in values between the two. And so as I've gone down it, I've just painted around just to give an indication of those ropes tied around the top. It's just a few lines there left unpainted. And then continue on down to the steps, and picking up that ivory black at the base, because that's where it's darkest there, and picking it off that pan, it was almost pure paint, and then just dropping it into the that post that was still quite damp, so it just blends in. We're doing almost a little bit of wet in wet there, wet in wet to get those soft edges appearing. And then post number 2 in a similar way, but a nice different angle to it. So I think from the composition point of view, that was quite nice, that they're pointing in opposite directions rather than all going the same way, which probably would have worked if they were both going tilting to the left or tilting to the right. Probably would have worked. Slightly different rope pattern around the top. The ropes that are securing the canopy above the barge. Lower down, So you can see it's quite easy to make brown when you've only got 3 colours. And I think having a reduced palette like this, it does simplify things a great deal. And if you've got in front of you a palette that's got 20, 30, 40 colours that I do see with some other people, to me, in my opinion, that's just so confusing. If I wanted a green or I wanted a brown, which green do I choose? Which brown do I choose? And sometimes they're not. They look a bit false when you take them straight out of the when you take the manufacturer's green unadulterated with something else. It's they do need to be added to something, and that's why I prefer to work with a limited palette, 3 colours, 6 colours, maybe a few more, and it's just fun making these different combinations, and you end up with in watercolor you end up with some quite nice effects. So steps, quite an important phase, and I want to retain the brightly lit edge of these steps, so that's why I've left that little line. Again, the pencil marks are showing through, helping me in this. So holding the brush at the tip again, just to give me a bit more control. Doesn't matter if I leave a few little dots here and there, as you can see. That just adds to the charm of watercolor. Just having those little bits left unpainted. Could be anything. Could be some nails hitting the sunlight, or rubbish on the street, or just the sunlight hitting some other object. So quite cool. So we've got this coolness in the foreground, and if you like, the warmth of the buildings opposite us, and to some extent on the right hand side, the shops on the right hand side, they're a lovely red and yellow colour. So pick up a bit of blue, bit of red, and get in the key side here. This walkway up to that shard of light coming across the square. And then over to the right. And this walkway is not all one value. It's quite dark in the bottom right hand corner. So that's why with this mop brush I'm just adding in darker values there. Assisted with my ivory black. Now it's fairly dark on the edge of this these shops on the right hand side. It's fairly dark there. Nice bit of contrast with the bright sky behind. Doesn't matter if I do leave out again just little bits of the paper unpainted. There was the middle shop has a lot of yellow in it, and there's reds, all sorts of lovely ochre-like colours in there, so that's why I've added all those in there. Now down to these shop blinds. And then down to street level. And right at the end of the street, the value of the end building is almost, well, fairly similar to the shade in the square behind, so there's not too much of a difference there. The biggest contrast in values, of course, is at the top where we've got the sky behind. And while it's moist, I'm adding in thicker colours. As it dries, it will become a little less intense, and it will go a little bit lighter as well, so you've got to try and overcompensate for that, perhaps going a bit darker than you think, add in a brighter colour than you think. It will mute itself down. Now this canopy, again, quite an important part of the composition, quite a nice opposite angle to the steps coming down, and it has at the edge these little square shapes. We'll come up to the post. The canopy is darker than the post, so we're constantly looking at all of these different objects and trying to think, is that lighter than that, is that darker than that, and trying to get that correct in the painting. Up to the front of the canopy. Later on we're going with the darker bits underneath. So next we'll do the people and the barge. Starting at the back of the barge, or the side of the barge, this ragged edge to all of this produce being silhouetted, and we need that good edge again. We need a brush with a good edge to get some sharp edges appearing there. It's just a haphazard conglomeration of different shapes and lines going all over the place. And up to the post. Again, it's darker than the post. Back up to the top, pick up a bit of ivory black for these figures. Now I could use a smaller brush here, but in the interest of continuity I'm just sort of continuing on with the same brush. And I've just spotted a little hair coming out of the top of that brush. Inevitably hairs when they come out of a mop brush. It's always those precious middle hairs that come out first, that over time they help to lose its point. Right, I think we're all right now. So sort of following the shape I did of the figure, starting with the head, and this is quite simple because being a silhouette ship, I don't need to bother about skin tones and the like, and what are they wearing. It's just the shape there of that figure. Again, dark up against the value of that post. That second post was a bit lighter than the first post. Right, second figure in the boat at a slightly different angle. And on down, meeting that figure, the shopper, on the quay side. So they've got some produce in front of them, these market sellers, so pick up a bit of yellow. Maybe it's they're selling lemons or something, or greens. Be a bit careful going down the edge of that post, and then this little pillar at the bottom of the steps, or this bollard, likewise painting around that as well. Darker at the base, again a very dark part of the overall scene, the edge of the boat up against the side of the canal, likewise on the other side of that pillar, that post, nice and dark, meeting the joining up with that shopper, that figure. Now, slightly smaller brush here, a synthetic brush from this one is an Escoda brush. Again, I need a fairly good point for doing this figure. Now, figures this size I might do with a brush just like this, or this sort of brush, or a smaller mop brush, just to get a bit more of a looser feeling to it. But I've just gone with this one for this time. So I don't always use the same brush for figures. So again, starting with the head, and because it's in the shade. So now this figure meeting the shadows, it is darker than the shadows. So as in the photograph, if you look at the figures, we've got the street in quite deep shade, but the figures are darker still. So that's what we've got to be mindful of here, is doing that. So this figure now, this is the largest of the figures in the painting, and this figure is walking away from us, the shopper with the shopping trolley pulling on the left hand side. So using the same brush, and having that shopping trolley conveniently behind the figure, I don't need to bother about legs on this one. So one less thing to think about. Trying to think now what a shopping trolley looks like, but it's just a rectangle, maybe a little bit wider at the base, a couple of wheels. Now of course there aren't shadows to these figures in the shadow, but the surface of the quayside here is quite shiny, being a warm day and all the foot traffic over it for many centuries. So we just need to maybe, with a few dry brush strokes or similar, just add in almost like a reflection. Just going in with a bit more detail here of that figure, perhaps a jacket. And then the slightly more distant figure, joining up with that first shopper. And just not too much detail for the legs, but it's serving the purpose of joining these different elements together. It's joined with that other figure. It's connecting the foreground with the background, as well as the shopper with the shopping trolley is doing. Then that light figure, just added a few more details to that. Face, legs. Use the finger to smudge out things a little bit. Use a paper towel to lift out while things are still moist. Just lift out a bit of paint here and there. Now while I've got this brush, we can start to add in a few more details to the buildings. So this, of course, the bell tower has got some bells in it, but I'm not going to pay too much attention to that. It's just quite nice seeing that light going through. Those two arches on the front of the bell tower coming on further down. Horizontal line of the building just in front of the bell tower. A handy little bit of darkness, a bit more dark below that rooftop, coming down to that figure, just giving a bit more contrast, as you can see, to the head and the shoulders, which you can do with maybe a darker window behind the figure, or a darker doorway, or the darker side of this building. So just a few lines to indicate the shop blinds coming down, just a few of them. Now, the far side of the canal, of course, there are quite a few windows there. Millions of windows in Venice, all different shapes and architectural details. But we've got to simplify things and just have a few of them painted in with this a smaller brush again, thinking about perspective, and those pencil lines, those guidelines are going to help me get the sizes right. So larger, more spread out, closer towards us, smaller and closer together, going further away. Just a few almost horizontals there. And there's a line going down. I don't know whether it's power cables or something down that building, but it needs something to again help us with the composition and perspective and leading the eye down through into the middle of the picture. So it can be anything. Could have been a dry brush stroke, just one or two thin dark lines. A few more windows. And not too much detail to the windows either. I know they've got complicated shutters on them and they're open at different angles, which would be quite time consuming and fiddly to do. But the danger is that if you put too much detail into these windows, then the viewer's eye is wandering up there, and it doesn't become a piece of art. What we're trying to do here is create a piece of art, not trying to copy the photograph exactly. We're just putting our own stamp on it, if you like, to give it that phrase, to our impression of those windows. So just a few lines towards the bottom of the those buildings as well, almost at the level of the water. Right, a few more darks. A few dark lines on these fruit and veg boxes at the end of the barge. And of course we need to get in this pillar as well. Now it's got quite a light top to it, so I haven't done too much to that, but gets a little bit darker. All sorts of different values going here, but it's generally a little bit lighter than the barge behind. And more of a light brown colour compared to the coolness of the street side. I'll pick up a few more details on the ropes, and then underneath the canopy the darkness underneath. Just follow that curve on round, and a few little pointy bits sticking out at the front. The rope. This figure needs a slightly darker face, I think, just to make it a bit more interesting in the shade there. Perhaps there's another figure in the background, way in the distance. So these shop blinds, nice dark lines here indicating those. And then underneath them quite dark with the with their supports and the windows and doors below them. Some darker windows at the top, and like the left hand side, thinking about perspective as well. And then just a few marks at the top of that first level, and a few dry, well, we're using dry brush strokes now, and a jagged line. That's getting a little bit wider as it comes towards us. Darks underneath the shop blinds, down to street level. And not the complete doorway either, just sort of partially drawn in. So you can see now with making these marks, we're adding a bit more form to things and definition to the shapes, and getting those angle of those steps, so they're starting to look a little bit more like steps now, a bit more realistic. Another line underneath that, the cap of that pillar. Then we've got the railings coming down the steps, so I need to be quite careful with this. Now I hadn't drawn those in initially. I could have done, but sometimes I'll change my mind about where exactly those railings might be. So of course trying to make them parallel to the steps as well, down to the bottom, and then some uprights and just an indication of a few diagonal bits as well, not all of them. And there we are, so a few connecting ropes to the posts. And then the side of the barge. So getting a bit more darks down towards the bottom. Now, going across the promenade here, the quayside, we do need a few horizontals just to give the impression of these slabs of the pavement slabs and these joints, these mortar lines. Just a few, and of just a few in the distance. And those little areas that were left unpainted, I've just added something darker underneath them. I don't know what it is, but I've just retained those, haven't gone over those little lighter areas. Add something dark underneath them. So these figures do need a little bit of a reflection, not too much. Bit of reflection here, because the surface is so shiny. It's almost like a mirror in a way. So another line at the top of those first floor windows, thinking about the perspective again. Perhaps a sort of darker doorway in here. It just needs something in that corner, so it's not too bland. On the far side of the square, perhaps there's something hanging from underneath the canopy there. I think there was some lights or something like that, so just the impression of a few light bulbs strung along. These steps do need a darker vertical edge to them. So picked up the mop brush and we're almost glazing over the top now. Another watercolor technique by adding in these different layers when everything is totally dry underneath, just to darken things up. And then of course as those steps go down to the bottom, we can't see so much of that that vertical edge. So we just need to add a few more details to these figures and the pavement, that I think we're almost done on this. Bit of a line going up the canopy, another rope. And then a few vertical lines down the posts. Perhaps a darker top to them as well. It's almost because there's not much water on the brush, it's almost like dry brush strokes now. Scrape a bit of dark down. Perhaps some chimney pots and things on those far buildings. There are some power cables or utility cables going across the canal, across the street. It needs a few more little verticals down the far end of this row of streets. So I've just added something dark to that lighter bit there. There's all sorts going on. When you look at something for a longer time, you just notice more little things appearing. Chimneys, cables, windows. So we're trying to be brief here, not trying to be too detailed. Put a dark jacket on this figure. So like I did with the other figures, just a few dry brush strokes coming down from that figure because of that shiny surface to the street. few more horizontal lines on the street level. At different spacing and angles, just to give it that more of a vintage look to it. The church does need a few more verticals from those two archway marks. Slightly darker on the left hand side of the spire. And the little details towards the top of the bell tower as well. Horizontal line. I think we're done. So here's the finished painting. So this video is all about different things to think about on handling figures that are in deep shadow or shade, or in a dark area of a picture. And we see here the two main ways of handling that: having figures silhouetted, so darker figure against a lighter background, lighter figure as in that one in the distance against a darker background. So thinking about the silhouetting and the different values there. And similarly, the handling of figures actually in shade itself, so making them either darker, generally darker. If you look at any photograph that you might have taken, most of the time, unless it's summer, most of the time, or hot weather, most of the time people have darker clothing. So they're going to be darker than their surroundings, which makes life easier from a watercolor point of view, because we start by painting our lights and then we get darker. So these figures are generally darker. Maybe in the shadows as well, there's less definition to them, so we can cheat a little bit with missing out their lower parts of their body or their legs, and have them almost connected with the shadows, as you might have seen with a few of my other videos, doing that as well as another little trick. So a loose feel to it. And from a watercolor point of view, a good exercise in the different techniques that we've been using, laying down the first wash, a bit of wet in wet, and then a few sort of graded washes as well, glazing, dry brush strokes, a bit of lost and found, so a bit of everything. So hopefully you like that video. Please have a look at the other videos in my playlist. Please add in your comments as well. I'd love to hear any feedback from you or ideas about future videos. Some of my subscribers have been sending in photographs that they've taken themselves for future consideration as subjects for follow-up demos by me. So thanks very much for everyone that's submitted a photograph so far. If you do have any ideas, then please pop those into the comments there, or you can email me privately. My name is Tim Wilmot, and my email address is timothy.wilmot@gmail.com. timothy@gmail.com. So catch more of my works up on my website, which is timwilmot.com, timwilmot.com. You'll see more details of the workshops I run. If anyone's interested in a one-to-one over the web, a one-to-one painting session, I've done quite a few of these. So whatever time zone you're in, whatever country you're in, at a time to suit you, we can meet up. I've got all the technology available to do that. So all you need to think about is a time suitable for you, and of course a subject to paint. Think about what you want to achieve in, say, a couple of hours online one-to-one tuition with me. You do need a webcam so I can see your work as we're doing it. So you can see my progress, I can see your progress. A great way of working together online in whatever time zone you're at. So please see more details up on my website and some of the charges for that. So thanks very much for your time, and hopefully catch up with you next time. Look forward to hearing from your comments. Thank you very much indeed.